Yeah, I lost it, but I can look behind me, I can find it.
For years, Red Skelton told interviewers he painted clowns because he didn't know why. Then he paused and admitted he did know. But he refused to explain. That silence followed him to his grave. When construction workers finally began demolishing parts of his estate, they broke through into a room that had been closed off and forgotten. Inside were over 1,000 paintings, personal letters, and objects connected to the son he lost in 1958. Nobody outside the family had seen any of it. The room had no windows and no door from the outside. Red had built himself a place where the clown didn't have to smile. Most people remember Red Skelton as the rubber-faced comedian who made America laugh for 2 decades. They remember him on television, his face twisted into impossible expressions, his body contorting in ways that seemed to defy physics. They remember the characters, Junior with his bratty voice saying, "I doed it," and Freddie the freeloader with his sad, gentle presence. They remember tuning in on Tuesday nights and feeling like they were visiting an old friend. What they don't remember, what almost nobody knew, is that the man behind the makeup was slowly dying inside while he made millions laugh. The story of Red Skelton's hidden room is not really about paintings or money. It's about what happens when a man spends his entire life performing for others while his own world collapses in silence. It's about the price of making people happy. It's about the distance between the face you show the world and the person you are when nobody is watching. And it's about one room, sealed off and forgotten, that eventually revealed everything. Red Skelton came into the world on July 18, 1913, in Vincennes, Indiana, and from the very first moment, loss was already part of his story. His father, Joseph E. Skelton, had died exactly 2 months earlier on May 20, 1913, after complications from a stroke. So Red was born into grief before he was even old enough to understand it. His mother, Ida May, was suddenly left alone to raise 4 boys. Whatever stability the family once had quickly slipped away. Their grocery business was gone. Their home was gone. What remained was struggle and the kind of daily hardship that shaped Red before he ever stepped onto a stage. But here's where the real story begins. Red grew up telling people his father was a clown with the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus and that he died under the big top in some dramatic, theatrical way. It was a beautiful lie, the kind of story that fit perfectly with the image he would later build for himself. Researchers would eventually uncover the truth. His father was not a circus performer. He was a grocer in Vincennes, a man worn down by alcohol and financial trouble, a man whose life had been ordinary and difficult and ultimately unremarkable. Red covered that painful truth with mythology because the truth was too ordinary, too sad, too close to something he couldn't face. Even then, long before fame, he was already learning how to turn pain into performance. Section 2, 450 words. The family's poverty was brutal in ways that modern audiences can barely comprehend. People in Vincennes remembered the Skeltons as being so poor they did not even have the basic things most families took for granted. They slept in an attic where snow sometimes drifted onto the beds during winter. Ida May cleaned houses and scraped together whatever she could. The boys fought over food. There were no safety nets waiting to catch them. No one was coming to save them. By the time Red was still just a child, poverty had already marked him in the eyes of the town. Parents warned their daughters to stay away from him as if bad luck itself might rub off. That kind of childhood hardens a person, but it also sharpens them. Red learned early how to watch people, how to read a room, how to notice the little things others missed. By age 7 in 1920, he was already working. He sold newspapers at the corner of 5th and Main outside the Pantages Theater, yelling headlines for pennies so he could help feed his mother and brothers. He worked in the cold, got pushed around by bullies, and rose before dawn. Some days brought a lucky break, like the time a mason tipped him $5, which was a huge amount for a boy like him. Most days brought almost nothing. School had no real chance against hunger, and by the time he was around 10, the pull of survival had already started dragging him away from the classroom. Then came the moment that changed the direction of his life. In 1923, while Red was still selling papers outside the theater, comedian Ed Wynn stopped and bought his whole stack. More than that, Wynn took the boy backstage. For Red, that was not just a kind gesture. It was a door opening. He saw the lights, the stage, the magic of performance, and something inside him locked onto it right away. That night gave him a dream bigger than Vincennes, bigger than poverty, bigger than the attic where snow fell on the bed. He did not just want out. He wanted show business. He wanted to become someone who could make people forget their pain, just like Ed Wynn had made him forget his own. Once the dream took hold, school began to fade even faster. Red never made it far in formal education. By 1926 or 1927, when he was around 13 or 14, he had fully left school behind. He never earned a diploma, but by then he had already found another kind of education, one far rougher and far more demanding. The stage became his classroom. Crowds became his teachers. Failure became the lesson he had to survive again and again. Every night was a test. Every audience was a jury. And the only way to survive was to be funnier than your circumstances, sharper than your fear, more resilient than your hunger. By 1925, while still barely more than a child, he had run off with Doc Lewis's patent medicine show. He was only around 12 years old, but the road did not care about age. Section 3, 450 words. Medicine shows were rough, shameless businesses that sold fake cures to poor and desperate people. They traveled from town to town, setting up in rural places, drawing crowds with music, jokes, and spectacle, then selling bottles that promised relief for every possible pain. Red started at the bottom, helping however he could, earning around $10 a week, sleeping in wagons, eating scraps, and sending money home when he was able. The work was hard, but it taught him something fundamental. If you could not hold a crowd, you disappeared. That world had no patience. People would walk away the second they got bored. So Red learned fast. He sang, joked, stumbled, improvised, and slowly turned himself into someone worth watching. One story from those years says that when he was around 16, he fell off the stage and smashed medicine bottles by accident. Instead of killing the act, it got a huge laugh. That mistake became material. That was the pattern of his life. Pain turned into comedy. Embarrassment turned into applause. Disaster turned into momentum. He learned that if you could make people laugh at your own humiliation, you were no longer the one being humiliated. You were the one in control. You were the one with power. From there, the road only got rougher and stranger. He moved through tent shows, minstrel routines, burlesque houses, riverboats, and walkathons. On riverboats like the Cotton Blossom in the late 1920s, Red performed for whatever audience showed up. These were not polished crowds. These were random, restless people, many of them poor themselves, many already half distracted. The work demanded physical comedy, loud timing, quick recovery, and nerves strong enough to survive humiliation. At one point, after a stock company failure, he ended up stranded near the Missouri River. At another, he was thrown into chaos-filled productions where the disorder almost became the act itself. But even when things went wrong, audiences laughed, and Red kept learning how to turn confusion into entertainment. Those riverboat years also gave him something deeper than stage experience. Watching hobos along the banks, seeing men drift through hard times with almost nothing, he stored those images away. Years later, they would live again in Freddie the Freeloader, one of his most famous characters. Freddie was funny, yes, but he also carried sadness inside him. That mix did not come from nowhere. It came from the boy who had known hunger and from the young performer who had spent years watching broken people try to keep moving. By his late teens, Red had already lived more lives than many men twice his age. Around 1930 and 1931 in Kansas City, he was emceeing walkathons and burlesque shows, surviving on nerve and motion. These walkathons were a very Depression-era kind of madness, brutal contests where people walked for endless hours while crowds watched them collapse from exhaustion. Red worked as the master of ceremonies, keeping energy alive in rooms filled with fatigue. He had to stretch jokes, fill silence, lift the dead air, and hold attention for hours. That kind of work could break a weak performer. For Red, it made him sharper. Section 4, 450 words. It was during this stretch that Edna Stillwell entered his life, and once she did, everything began to change. She first met him in Kansas City when she was still a teenager herself, working as an usherette. At first, she was not impressed. He asked to walk her home, and she turned him down. But later, at a walkathon, they crossed paths again, and this time, the connection stuck. They married young, broke, and full of nerve. In many ways, Red had talent and instinct, but Edna gave that talent shape. She saw what worked, what did not, and what he could become if he stopped relying on chaos alone. She did far more than stand beside him. She rewrote jokes. She built routines. She organized his material. She helped manage money. She pushed him to think bigger and work smarter. When a vaudeville act started to die, she stepped in with new scripts, and the crowd roared. She helped create the famous donut dunking routine. She helped shape the character of Junior, the mean little kid, inspired by Red's own childish tantrums and stubborn streak. That became one of his most famous personas, complete with the line "I doed it," which would later spread far beyond comedy into national culture. Edna was not just part of the act. She was one of the engines behind it. She wrote scripts, managed deals, rejected weak offers, and made sure Red did not get trapped in small-time work when bigger chances were possible. Together, they moved from struggling road performers toward national attention. By the mid-1930s, vaudeville had become a real path forward. By 1937, Red's breakthrough on national radio was close. That breakthrough came with the Rudy Valley Show and then exploded on October 7, 1941, when Red Skelton launched his own NBC program, the Raleigh Cigarette Program. The timing could not have been better. Radio was the center of American entertainment, and Red landed a powerful Tuesday night slot right after Bob Hope. Suddenly, the boy from Vincennes was entering millions of homes every week. His show mixed monologues, music, and sketches, and audiences responded fast. By early 1944, the ratings were enormous. He was no longer just a survivor from the road. He was a star. And with radio came the characters that made him unforgettable. There was Clem Cattlehopper, the slow and bewildered country innocent. There was Willie Lump Lump, the lovable drunk. There was Junior, with his mischief and his stubborn little voice. These characters did not feel distant or polished. They felt lived in. People recognized them. They quoted them. Junior's "I Did It" became so popular that it even turned up in headlines. Skelton had found something powerful. He was not just telling jokes. He was creating a comic world people wanted to return to every week. Hollywood noticed. MGM signed him in 1941 after a screen test that showed off exactly what made him special. He was quick, physical, loose, and fearless. Films followed in a rush. In these movies, Red played detectives, fools, dreamers, and accident-prone heroes. The same man who had once survived by being funnier than disaster was now turning that skill into box office success. But success, as it always does, came with a price. Section 5, 450 words. Then, just as his career was peaking, everything changed. In March 1943, Red married Georgia Davis, a younger MGM actress. They married during one of his military furloughs while he was serving in World War II. After the war, they settled in California and started a family. Their daughter Valentina was born on May 5, 1947, and their son Richard was born on May 20, 1948. For a while, it looked as though Red had everything. He had a powerful career, a popular show, a stable marriage, and 2 young children. But in 1957, that picture shattered completely. Richard, only 9 years old, was diagnosed with leukemia. Doctors told the family the disease was incurable. Some said he might have only 1 year left. Others believed he might have as little as 5 months. That news hit at the exact moment Red was at the height of his television fame. Week after week, America watched him make millions laugh while he carried private fear that almost no one could see. CBS offered him time away from the show, but Red refused to disappear for long. He believed that continuing to perform helped keep some sense of normal life alive for Richard, who watched his father on television from the hospital. Red held himself together in public because he felt he had to. He thought that if the show stayed normal, then maybe his son's world could stay normal too. The family tried everything they could to bring Richard moments of joy while time was slipping away. They traveled with him around the world. On July 22, 1957, they met Pope Pius XIII in Vatican City. Richard called that meeting the highlight of the trip. But even that journey could not stay peaceful. British newspapers hounded the family so harshly that they had to cut the trip short and return to the United States early. Back home, the stress kept building. In November 1957, Red fell down a flight of stairs. Then, on December 30th, he nearly died at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica after suffering a cardiac asthma attack. Doctors later said he had taken 9 out of 10 steps toward death. Even so, he recovered and returned to the show again on January 28, 1958. He kept working while Richard endured daily blood transfusions, constant needle punctures, and endless suffering. Then came May 10, 1958. Richard's last day was heartbreaking in its ordinary little details. Just 10 days before what would have been his 10th birthday, Richard spent his final conscious hours with his father at his bedside, flipping through a Sears Roebuck catalog and pointing at gifts he wanted. Around 7:30 p.m., a massive hemorrhage sent him into a coma. About an hour later, he woke briefly and said to his mother, "I can't see. Everything is fuzzy." Then he slipped away. He died at 8:35 p.m. The grief that followed never truly left. Red buried his son in May 1958, and friends stepped in to help. He came back on May 27, but the man who returned was not the same one who had left. Richard's room was left untouched. His bed, his toys, and everything stayed exactly where they had been, turning the room into a kind of shrine. Red would sit there alone for long stretches, unable to move past the loss. In the years that followed, he reportedly visited Richard's grave every birthday with a small cake, staying until sunset. And hidden inside his ranch was one of the most intimate parts of his later life: his private art space. The 3-studio bunkhouse was where he spent more and more of his time, especially as the years passed. There were no producers there, no cameras, no applause, just canvases, brushes, oils, clowns, and silence. After his death, people found paintings stacked against walls, unfinished works, and rooms that still seemed to hold the shape of his absence. There were brushes left as if he had just put them down. It felt less like an art studio and more like a diary no one had read in full. By then, his paintings had become one of the strangest second acts in show business. He had completed more than 1,000 oil paintings, most of them clowns. What mattered even more than the money was what the paintings seemed to reveal. Curators and collectors often noticed the same themes returning again and again: loss, loneliness, childhood, distance, smiles that did not fully convince, eyes that looked too tired. The clown seemed to hold the things Red rarely said out loud. In one interview from 1964, when asked why he always painted clowns, he first said he did not know, then corrected himself and admitted that he did know, though he refused to explain. That tiny pause may say more than any full explanation ever could.